Chapter 1: Gilded Cage. I stood perfectly still as Madame Beauchamp's cool fingers pressed another pin into the gleaming silk of my wedding gown. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through Father's tall mansion windows should have warmed the fabric, but I felt only a persistent chill seeping through the layers of taffeta and petticoats. My corset pinched with each shallow breath, much like my future seemed to constrict before me. "Just a few more pins, Miss Montgomery," Madame Beauchamp mumbled, her French accent thickened by the straight pins clutched between her pursed lips. She circled me like a predator, tugging and smoothing the expensive fabric draped across my rigid form. Beyond the leaded glass windows, a pair of sparrows darted through the spring air, free and unconstrained. I envied their liberty with an ache that threatened to crack my carefully maintained composure. Back and forth they flew, building their nest in the oak tree's sprawling branches, while I remained trapped in my father's mansion, being fashioned into a suitable bride for a man 3 decades my senior. "Would you like a sip of water, miss?" Martha whispered, her weathered face creased with concern as she approached with a silver tray. My lady's maid for 15 years, she knew my thoughts often before I voiced them. "Thank you," I murmured, grateful for her small kindness. Martha's eyes held understanding that needed no words. She too saw this gown for what it truly was, not a symbol of joyful union, but a gilded prison fashioned of French silk and Belgian lace. I gestured at the bodice where thousands of seed pearls and crystal beads created an elaborate pattern that caught the light with every breath. "Is all this embellishment necessary? It feels excessive." "Mr. Harrington specifically requested it," my father's voice from the doorway startled us all. Edward Montgomery, Boston banking magnate, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, examining me with the same critical eye he used to assess new acquisitions for the family collection. "He wants his bride to outshine every woman in Boston." His tone brooked no argument, as it hadn't since Mother's passing 5 years prior. Where once there had been warmth in our home, now only ambition and calculation remained. I lowered my gaze, my reflection in the mirror suddenly unbearable. The truth settled over me like the heavy veil waiting on the chaise lounge. I was merely another acquisition, another asset to be displayed at Maxwell Harrington's convenience. Not a daughter to be cherished or a woman with dreams of her own, but a bauble to adorn his arm, and a name to improve his social standing. That evening I retired early, pleading a headache that wasn't entirely feigned. Sleep eluded me, however, and I eventually rose to fetch a book from the library downstairs. Father rarely permitted novels in the house, deeming them frivolous entertainments that fill a woman's head with nonsense. But I had secreted away a volume of Tennyson's poetry behind a dreary economic treatise. As I descended the grand staircase, the polished mahogany banister cool beneath my palm, Maxwell Harrington's distinctive voice drifted from my father's study. The door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of lamplight spilling onto the Persian carpet. I paused, my slippered feet silent on the thick pile. "Montgomery's banking empire is hanging by a thread," Maxwell said, his tone revealing the smug satisfaction he took in my father's misfortune. "Once I've secured his daughter and her inheritance, I'll have controlling interest in the bank. And as for Eleanor, she'll learn her place quickly enough. Too many books and ideas in that pretty head." My stomach twisted violently at his words. I gripped the banister, steadying myself. "You'll still move forward with the arrangements at the Boston branch?" my father asked, his voice unnaturally subservient, stripped of the commanding presence I'd known all my life. "Of course," Maxwell's voice oozed false generosity. "You'll remain as figurehead, but decisions will require my approval." I backed away from the door, heart hammering against my ribs. The blood rushed in my ears, nearly drowning out their continued conversation. Father wasn't arranging an advantageous match. He was selling me to save himself from financial ruin. And Maxwell, with his calculating eyes and reputation for cruelty, saw me as nothing more than a business acquisition and a troublesome mind to be subdued. My knees weakened as I retreated up the stairs. Each step required deliberate concentration as the terrible truth crystallized in my mind. In 10 days' time, I would be Maxwell Harrington's property, with no more rights than the furniture in his mansion or the horses in his stable. "Miss Eleanor, whatever's happened?" Martha exclaimed when she entered my bedchamber with the evening tea tray. I hadn't bothered lighting the lamps, preferring the concealing shadows as I paced the Aubusson carpet, my dressing gown clutched tight around my trembling form. "I cannot marry him, Martha," I choked out as fresh tears spilled down my cheeks. "He's cruel and only wants my inheritance." The words, spoken aloud, unleashed a torrent of emotion I could no longer contain. "Father knows. He's made a bargain with the devil, and I'm to be the sacrifice." Martha set down the tray with a decisive clink and crossed to the windows, drawing the heavy velvet curtains against any watching eyes. Then she sat beside me on the edge of the bed, taking my cold hands in her work-roughened ones. "My brother James is a train conductor on the Western Line," she said, her voice low and urgent. "He helps women like you start fresh. My cousin teaches school in Colorado Territory." Her eyes, gray as a winter sky, held mine steadily. "There are possibilities, Miss Eleanor, if you've courage enough to seize them." "I couldn't possibly," I began. But the alternative, life with Maxwell Harrington, rose before me like a specter. A man who had driven his first wife to an early grave through neglect and cruelty, if the whispers were to be believed. "You have your mother's teaching certificate," Martha reminded me. "I saved it after she passed. And you have her spirit too, if you'd remember it." My gaze drifted to Mother's portrait on my bedside table. Caroline Montgomery's eyes seemed to follow me, gentle yet resolute. She had championed education for women long before it was fashionable, teaching in a small academy until her marriage. "A brave heart finds a way forward," she used to tell me, "even when the path seems darkest." I traced my finger along the silver frame, remembering her final days, how she'd made me promise to live courageously, to find joy regardless of circumstance. Would she consider this courage or cowardness? Fleeing rather than facing my duty? But then, had she known Father would use me as currency in his desperate business dealings? Morning brought no peace, only hardened resolve. After a night of prayers and tears, I approached Father's study with trembling hands but determined spirit. The heavy oak door, like so much in our home, was designed to intimidate, massive and unyielding, carved with the Montgomery family crest. I knocked firmly, waiting for his curt enter before stepping into the tobacco-scented sanctuary that had once welcomed me as a child, but now served as headquarters for his failing empire. "Father," I began, standing before his imposing desk rather than taking the offered chair, "please reconsider this match. Mr. Harrington has a terrible reputation. His first wife—" "Enough!" Father slammed his leather-bound ledger closed with such force that the crystal inkwell jumped. "The arrangements are final. You'll do your duty to this family, Eleanor. Your mother would expect nothing less." The invocation of Mother's memory ignited a rare spark of anger within me. Mother would never ask me to sacrifice my happiness for financial gain. She believed marriage should be founded on mutual respect and affection. "You know nothing of the real world." He rose, his imposing height meant to cow me into submission as it had so many business rivals. "This marriage ensures your security and the Montgomery legacy. Without it, we face ruin." "So I am to be sold to secure your debts?" I dared ask, my voice barely above a whisper. His face hardened. "You are to be married to a man of means and position who can provide for you as I have. Your romantic notions are childish and impractical." In that moment, looking into eyes the same shade as my own yet devoid of paternal tenderness, I saw the truth. To my father, I was not a daughter to be cherished, but currency to be traded, a final asset to be leveraged before bankruptcy claimed his empire. Whatever fragile hope I'd harbored for his intervention crumbled to dust. "Hold still, miss," Martha whispered, the scissors gleaming in the lamplight as they sliced through my waist-length auburn hair. Each snip felt like severing another tie to the life I'd known. Long curls fell to the floor around my feet, 23 years of carefully tended tresses becoming a circle of copper in the dim light. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the small rebellion taking place within these walls. Midnight had come and gone, leaving us in that liminal space where brave decisions either falter or crystallize into action. "There," Martha said, setting the scissors aside and handing me a small looking glass. "A respectable length for a young widow." I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me. With my hair falling just past my shoulders and the simple gray traveling dress replacing my usual finery, I looked transformed. Less Miss Eleanor Montgomery of Beacon Hill, and more the fictitious Mrs. Ellie Wilson, schoolteacher and recent widow. "James will meet you at South Station," Martha said, fastening a modest bonnet atop my shortened curls. She pressed a packet wrapped in oilcloth into my trembling hands. "Take this. Everything you'll need to start fresh." The packet contained identification papers naming me as Mrs. Ellie Wilson, teaching credentials based on Mother's own certificate but altered with my new name, and a train ticket to Denver. Martha had planned every detail, down to the simple gold band I now wore on my left hand. Her own mother's ring, she told me, to complete my disguise. "How can I ever repay you?" I whispered, embracing her fiercely. "Live well," she answered simply. "Find happiness. That's payment enough for these old bones." I placed my mother's well-worn Bible in my reticule, the one possession I couldn't bear to leave behind, and left a sealed note on Father's desk explaining that I could not proceed with the marriage but would pray for his understanding. I harbored no illusions he would grant it. Dawn painted the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold as I boarded the westbound train. Terror and exhilaration warred within me as I settled into my seat, watching Boston, the only home I'd ever known, slip away. The whistle shrieked, wheels ground against metal tracks, and my new life began with a lurch and rattle of iron. Free, terrified, alone, but blessedly, irrevocably free. Chapter 2: Redemption Creek. The rhythmic clacking of train wheels marked the passing hours as I journeyed westward, each mile peeling away another layer of Boston propriety like the shedding of an old skin. The familiar Massachusetts countryside had given way to New York, then Pennsylvania, and now the vast, rolling landscapes of territories I'd only read about in books. Outside my window, America unfurled in breathtaking splendor. Endless prairies dotted with wildflowers, distant purple mountains, and skies so vast they seemed to swallow the horizon. I smoothed my gray traveling dress, still stiff with newness, and withdrew the packet of documents from my reticule. The name Mrs. Ellie Wilson stared back at me from the falsified teaching certificate, the careful penmanship giving no hint of its fraudulent nature. I traced the unfamiliar signature with my fingertip, practicing the loops and curves until they might become as natural as the ones I'd left behind. "Thomas Wilson," I whispered, fabricating details about my fictitious late husband. "A clerk at a shipping company. Consumption took him after only 8 months of marriage." The story needed to be simple enough to remember, yet detailed enough to ring true. The compartment door slid open with a wooden rattle, interrupting my rehearsal. An elderly couple peered in, the woman with silver hair tucked neatly beneath a navy bonnet, the man sporting a full white beard and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Pardon the intrusion, my dear," the woman said. "Might we join you? The other compartments are quite full with a group of miners headed to the silver camps." "Of course," I replied, hastily tucking away my papers. "Please, there's ample room." They settled across from me, introducing themselves as Reverend Harold and Mrs. Ida Henderson, missionaries returning west after a fundraising trip to Boston. Their gentle manners and unpretentious conversation set me immediately at ease. "And you, my dear?" Mrs. Henderson inquired kindly. "Where are you headed, Mrs.?" "Wilson," I supplied, my heart skipping at the first real use of my new name. "Mrs. Ellie Wilson, and I'm not entirely certain of my final destination. I'm a teacher seeking a position." The half-truth slipped from my lips more easily than expected. Reverend Henderson's bushy eyebrow shot upward. "Providence!" he exclaimed, slapping his knee with such enthusiasm that his wife startled beside him. "Why, we've just come from Redemption Creek in the Colorado Territory. Their schoolteacher married the blacksmith and moved to Denver last month. The town council is desperate for a replacement before harvest season ends, and the children are needed in the fields." Mrs. Henderson nodded eagerly. "It's a fine community, Mrs. Wilson. Good Christian folk mostly, though of course every town has its characters." She leaned forward, patting my hand. "They're offering room and board plus a modest salary. Many young teachers find it a blessing to start there." I fought to keep my expression merely interested rather than desperate with relief. This couldn't be mere coincidence. To meet these kind people who offered exactly what I needed most. A strange warmth spread through my chest as I recognized this for what it truly was: divine guidance, the first real ray of hope since I'd fled Boston. "Tell me more about Redemption Creek," I said, unable to keep the eagerness from my voice. "I believe I'd like to apply for the position." 3 days later, the train whistle announced our arrival at Redemption Creek with a piercing shriek. I pressed my nose to the window, taking in my first glimpse of what might become my new home. The railway platform was little more than a wooden structure with a bench and small office, but beyond it stretched a dusty main street lined with wooden buildings in various states of weather-worn dignity. Majestic mountains rose in the distance, their snow-capped peaks gleaming against an impossibly blue sky. My stomach fluttered with equal parts anxiety and anticipation as the train shuddered to a stop. I gathered my belongings with trembling hands, smoothed my travel-wrinkled dress, and straightened my widow's bonnet. The modest trunk containing my few possessions suddenly seemed woefully inadequate preparation for my new life. The Hendersons led me onto the platform, where several townspeople had gathered for the twice-weekly train's arrival. Among them stood a tall man with silver at his temples, wearing a simple black coat with a clerical collar, clearly the town minister. "Reverend Thomas," Mrs. Henderson called, waving enthusiastically, "we've brought you a blessing from the Lord." The man approached, his face creasing into a warm smile that immediately set me at ease. "Harold! Ida, welcome home. We've missed your steady presence these past months." "Reverend Thomas, allow us to introduce Mrs. Ellie Wilson," Reverend Henderson said, gesturing toward me, "a qualified teacher seeking a position." Reverend Thomas turned to me, his eyes widening with barely concealed delight. "Mrs. Wilson, the Hendersons telegraphed ahead about you. You're an answer to prayer, ma'am." He extended his hand, clasping mine with genuine warmth. "Our children have been without proper instruction for nearly a month now." I managed a smile, trying to project a confidence I certainly didn't feel. "I hope I can be of service, Reverend. I'm eager to begin if the position is still available." "Available and desperately needed," he assured me. "The town council will want to meet you formally, of course, but with your credentials and the Hendersons' recommendation, I foresee no difficulties." As Reverend Thomas helped arrange for my trunk to be delivered to the boarding house, I felt the weight of someone's gaze upon me. Looking across the dusty street, I noticed a tall, broad-shouldered man standing outside what appeared to be a mercantile. A boy of perhaps 10 or 11 years stood at his side, their matching dark hair and serious expressions marking them unmistakably as father and son. The man's scrutiny held neither welcome nor hostility, merely curiosity and perhaps a hint of wariness. His stance spoke of quiet strength, shoulders square beneath a faded blue shirt, weathered hands resting easily at his sides. The boy, a smaller version of his father, regarded me with undisguised suspicion, his arms crossed defensively across his chest. Something in their isolated stance amid the bustling platform suggested a shared loneliness that resonated deep within me. Then the moment passed as Reverend Thomas called my name, and I turned away, wondering why the stranger's piercing gaze had affected me so. "Mind the third step, it creaks something fierce," Hattie Jenkins warned as she led me up the narrow staircase of her boarding house. "Been meaning to have that fixed, but good carpenters are busy folk in these parts." The plump, cheerful widow in her 60s had welcomed me with an enthusiasm that seemed her natural state of being. Within moments of meeting her, I'd been ushered into her tidy kitchen, seated at a scrubbed pine table, and presented with thick slices of freshly baked bread slathered with sweet churned butter. "This will be your room, Mrs. Wilson," she announced, pushing open a door at the end of the upstairs hallway. Not fancy like you might be used to back east, but clean and comfortable. The chamber was indeed simple. A narrow iron bedstead with a patchwork quilt, a small dresser with a porcelain basin and pitcher, a straight-backed chair, and a tiny writing desk positioned beneath the room's single window. Compared to my spacious bedchamber in Boston, with its four-poster bed and fine furnishings, it was modest in the extreme. Yet something about the room's honest simplicity appealed to me deeply. Sunlight streamed through the calico curtains, casting patterns on the polished wooden floor. A small vase of wildflowers graced the bedside table, and the linens smelled of sunshine and lavender. It's lovely, I said truthfully. Perfect for my needs, Hattie beamed, her round face creasing with pleasure. Teachers always stay here, have done since I opened this place after my Henry passed 15 years ago. She moved to the dresser, straightening an already straight doily. Bathrooms down the hall. We have indoor plumbing, pride of Redemption Creek. Town council voted for it 2 years back. Most homes still make do with outhouses, but progress comes even to small places like ours. I nodded gratefully, though privately I felt overwhelmed by the thought of shared bathing facilities and the modest accommodations so different from the luxurious privacy I'd known all my life. What would Martha think if she could see me now, preparing to sleep in a room smaller than my dressing room at home? Town council meets tomorrow to approve your position, Hattie continued, bustling around the small space, opening the window wider to catch the afternoon breeze. Though it's just a formality with Reverend Thomas's recommendation, he carries considerable weight in town matters. I'm grateful for his support, I said, sinking onto the edge of the bed as fatigue from the long journey suddenly caught up with me. Hattie patted my shoulder with motherly concern. You rest now, dear. Supper's at 6 sharp. We've got 3 other boarders, all men, working on the new railway spur. Decent fellows, if a bit rough around the edges. They'll be curious about you, but they mind their manners at my table or find themselves cooking their own meals. After she departed, I unpacked my modest belongings, each item a reminder of the life I'd left behind. Mother's Bible went onto the bedside table, my few dresses hung in the small wardrobe, and the false documents tucked safely into the desk drawer. When night fell, I knelt beside the narrow bed just as I had each night since childhood. The floorboards pressed hard against my knees, so different from the plush carpet of my Boston bedroom. Lord, I whispered into the darkness, I ask your forgiveness for my deception, however necessary it seemed. Guide my path in this new place. Help me to be worthy of these good people's trust, even if I cannot be fully honest about my past. My prayer continued, words tumbling out in a confused jumble of gratitude and fear until exhaustion claimed me and I crawled between the clean, rough sheets. My last thought before sleep claimed me was that perhaps, in this dusty little town with its grand name, I might find the redemption I so desperately sought. The town hall, little more than a large room above the general store, buzzed with low conversation as I entered the next afternoon. 5 council members sat behind a long table at the front. Reverend Thomas, whose encouraging smile offered silent support. A weathered man with a silver sheriff's badge who was introduced as Sheriff Daniels. A pinch-faced woman with iron gray hair pulled severely back, who I learned was Mrs. Foster, owner of the Mercantile, Mr. Peterson, an elderly banker with rheumy eyes and trembling hands, and to my surprise, the broad-shouldered man I'd noticed yesterday, Joshua Hayes, apparently a local rancher of some standing. My hands trembled slightly as I presented my credentials to the council, answering their questions about my teaching philosophy and experience with what I hoped was convincing composure. The falsified papers Martha had provided were excellent forgeries, detailed enough to withstand scrutiny, yet vague enough to avoid specific inquiries. You understand, Mrs. Wilson, that teaching here requires more than mere book learning, Reverend Thomas explained. Our children need practical knowledge suited to life in the West alongside traditional subjects. I believe education should prepare children for the lives they'll lead, I replied, while maintaining standards of academic excellence, of course. Sheriff Daniels nodded approvingly. Well said, ma'am. Too many Eastern teachers come with fancy ideas that don't hold water when the snow pile's 6 feet high or the crops need tending. Mrs. Foster, who had been eyeing me with unconcealed suspicion, leaned forward. Where did you teach before, Mrs. Wilson? Her tone suggested she'd been waiting to ask this particular question. I swallowed hard. A small private academy in Massachusetts. I answered truthfully, if incompletely, careful to maintain eye contact despite my racing heart. And your late husband, Mrs. Foster pressed, her thin lips pursed. What was his occupation? Thomas Wilson. The fictitious name still felt strange on my tongue. He worked for a shipping company. We were married briefly before he passed. My voice caught on the fabricated grief, but the council members mistook my discomfort for genuine sorrow. Mrs. Foster opened her mouth to continue her interrogation, but to my surprise, Joshua Hayes, who had remained silent throughout the interview, interrupted gently. "I think we've asked enough personal questions." His voice was deep and quiet, with a subtle authority that immediately silenced the room. "Mrs. Wilson's credentials speak for themselves. Our children need a teacher, and Providence has provided one with suitable qualifications." His unexpected intervention left me both grateful and puzzled. His dark eyes met mine briefly, not with warmth exactly, but with a straightforward decency that contrasted sharply with Mrs. Foster's suspicious scrutiny. The council voted unanimously to hire me, with a salary of $30 monthly plus room and board at Hattie's, as I signed the contract with my new name, Ellie Wilson. I wondered if they could hear the hammering of my heart or sense the mixture of relief and guilt that flooded through me. The schoolhouse, a weathered clapboard building with a small bell tower, stood at the edge of town, flanked by towering cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade in the yard where children would take their midday meal and recreation. Inside, a single large room contained rows of scarred wooden desks facing a teacher's platform and blackboard. A pot-bellied stove dominated one corner, cold now in the late spring warmth, but clearly essential during Colorado's harsh winters. I spent the entire weekend cleaning and organizing, scrubbing floors until my hands were raw, washing windows until they sparkled in the sunlight, arranging books on the small shelf, and preparing lessons for students whose abilities I could only guess at. Every muscle in my body ached from unaccustomed labor. I who had never so much as dusted a shelf in Boston, but the pain brought a strange satisfaction. This space was becoming mine, a tangible symbol of my new identity. Monday morning dawned clear and bright. I rang the school bell with trembling hands, then stood on the front steps, watching as children appeared from various directions. Some walking from town, others arriving on horseback or in farm wagons driven by parents eager to meet the new teacher. 18 pupils, ranging from 6 to 16 years, filled the schoolhouse with curious energy, finding seats and whispering among themselves as they assessed me. Most regarded me with straightforward curiosity or shy smiles, except for one, Caleb Hayes, who slumped in his seat near the back, arms crossed defiantly across his chest, his father's dark eyes glaring from beneath an unruly shock of black hair. I took a deep breath, smoothed my serviceable navy skirt, and faced my first class. "Good morning. I am Mrs. Wilson, your new teacher. I look forward to getting to know each of you in the coming days." 18 pairs of eyes stared back at me with expressions ranging from interest to indifference to outright hostility from young Mr. Hayes. "I'll be learning your names and assessing your progress this week," I continued, finding my voice growing stronger with each word. "But first, let's begin as we should begin all things, with Scripture. Please open your Bibles to the book of Joshua." Pages rustled as the children obeyed, some more quickly than others. "Be strong and courageous," I began. "For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go," a tall girl with braided blonde hair finished confidently from the front row. I smiled, feeling a sudden unexpected sense of belonging. In this moment, I wasn't Eleanor Montgomery fleeing a loveless marriage, nor was I Ellie Wilson living a lie. I was simply a teacher doing work that mattered, surrounded by children who needed what I could offer them. Yes, Joshua 1:9, exactly right. The morning light streamed through the newly cleaned windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden shafts above the children's heads. For the first time since leaving Boston, I felt the tight knot of fear in my chest begin to loosen. Whatever complications lay ahead, for this moment at least, I was exactly where I needed to be. Chapter 3. Finding Footing. The schoolhouse stood quiet in the gathering dusk as I bent over my desk, the golden light of the oil lamp casting long shadows across the scarred wooden surface. 2 weeks of teaching had passed in a blur of names, assessments, and adjustments as I familiarized myself with my students' capabilities, and they grew accustomed to my methods. The stack of arithmetic exercises before me revealed encouraging progress from most. Neat columns of figures, carefully worked problems, and evidence of genuine understanding. And then there was Caleb Hayes. I sighed, rubbing my tired eyes as I studied his latest paper. The calculations themselves showed remarkable insight. He'd solved complex problems using methods I hadn't taught, finding elegant shortcuts that demonstrated genuine mathematical talent. Yet the work itself was nearly illegible, his penmanship a chaotic sprawl across the page, letters transposed or missing entirely in his written explanations. The sharp sound of boots on the schoolhouse steps startled me from my contemplation. I looked up to find Joshua Hayes filling the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly spanning the frame, hat clutched respectfully in his hands. The fading sunlight caught the angles of his face, highlighting cheekbones weathered by years of outdoor work and eyes that missed little. "Mr. Hayes," I said, setting down my pencil, "what brings you by?" He stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. "Sheriff mentioned you've been walking home after dark. Not safe, ma'am." His deep voice held concern rather than censure. "Mountain lions been spotted closer to town than usual this season, and there's always the occasional drifter passing through." A flush of warmth touched my cheeks at his thoughtfulness. "I've been trying to give extra attention to some students who need it." I gestured toward the papers spread before me. "Grading takes longer than anticipated." His gaze moved from my face to the stack of papers, lingering on his son's work visible atop the pile. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Including my boy?" The perceptiveness of his question caught me off guard. Here was not the stern, taciturn rancher the town saw, but a father acutely aware of his child's struggles. I realized with sudden clarity that Joshua Hayes understood far more than he revealed. About his son, about the town, perhaps even about me. "Your son has a brilliant mind for mathematics," I said, showing Joshua his son's paper. "Look at how he solved this problem. He created a shortcut I hadn't even considered. It's genuinely impressive." We stood side by side at my desk, the lamp's glow warming the page between us. I watched as pride flickered across his face, quickly replaced by familiar concern as his finger traced the nearly indecipherable writing. "But he struggles with writing," I continued carefully. "His spelling is inconsistent, and he often reverses letters or omits them entirely. I suspect he might have difficulty seeing the letters properly. They may appear to shift or reverse in his vision." I expected defensiveness, perhaps even anger at my assessment. Instead, Joshua's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though I'd confirmed something he'd long suspected. "His mother was the same way," he said quietly, the mention of his late wife softening his voice. "Sarah could solve complex sums in her head, but mixed her letters. She hid it well, memorized words by their shape instead of spelling them out, only told me after we wed." The admission clearly cost him something. I sensed he rarely spoke of his wife to anyone, certainly not to a woman he barely knew. "With your permission," I said, "I'd like to try some special exercises with Caleb, methods that might help him see the letters more consistently." I hesitated, then added, "And perhaps spectacles might help. Sometimes these difficulties stem from vision problems." Joshua looked at me with surprise evident in his dark eyes. "You'd do that?" The last teacher just called him lazy, said he'd grow out of his carelessness if properly disciplined. Indignation flared within me. "Caleb is many things, Mr. Hayes, but lazy isn't among them. I've watched him tackle the most difficult problems with determination when he believes he can succeed." I met his gaze directly, finding myself suddenly passionate about this child I'd known for merely 2 weeks. "Every child deserves dignity, Mr. Hayes, and the chance to learn in their own way." Something in Joshua's expression shifted then, a barrier lowering, a judgment suspended. For the first time since my arrival in Redemption Creek, I felt seen, not as the mysterious widow from the East, but as a teacher who genuinely cared for her students. "I'd be obliged for any help you can give him," he said simply. "You stir too vigorously, Mrs. Wilson," Hattie chuckled, watching as I splashed gravy over the sides of the pot. "Gentle circles, like you're cradling a baby, not fighting a wildcat." Sunday after church had brought an invitation I couldn't politely decline. Dinner at Hattie's table with several town residents, including Reverend Thomas, Sheriff Daniels, and, to my simultaneous delight and trepidation, Joshua Hayes and his son. While the men gathered in Hattie's small parlor, she had drafted me to help in the kitchen, clearly unaware that I'd never prepared a meal in my life. "I'm afraid I'm rather hopeless at this," I admitted, surrendering the wooden spoon to her capable hands. "Weren't much call for cooking at that fancy academy of yours, I reckon," Hattie said without judgment. Well, never too late to learn useful skills. I turned my attention to slicing the fresh bread, only to hiss in pain as my hand brushed against the hot stove surface. A raised welt immediately formed across my palm, angry and red. "Let me see that," came a deep voice behind me. I turned to find Joshua Hayes had entered the kitchen unnoticed. Without waiting for permission, he took my injured hand in his own, examining the burn with a critical eye. "Fetch cold water, please, Mrs. Jenkins," he said, reaching into his pocket with his free hand. From it, he withdrew a small tin container. "Ranch work means always carrying burn ointment," he explained, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he applied the salve to my throbbing skin. "Branding season especially." The ointment brought immediate relief, but it was the careful ministration of his hands that sent an unexpected warmth through me. His fingers were work-roughened, yet moved with delicate precision, treating my minor injury with the same attentiveness he might give to a serious wound. Dinner itself proved a lively affair, with Sheriff Daniels regaling us with tales of his younger days as a Texas Ranger, and Reverend Thomas sharing news of missionary efforts among the mountain settlements. I navigated the conversation carefully, redirecting personal questions with practiced ease, focusing instead on town matters and the upcoming harvest festival. "Mrs. Wilson's teaching me to read differently," Caleb announced suddenly during a lull in conversation. "She says I see letters flip-flop sometimes, and it isn't 'cause I'm stupid." The table fell silent. Joshua's fork paused midway to his mouth. "She made me colored paper to put over the words," the boy continued, warming to his subject, "and I trace the letters with my finger while I say them out loud. Makes 'em stay put better." "That sounds like a fine method," Reverend Thomas said kindly. I felt Joshua's gaze on me from across the table. When I dared meet his eyes, I found them filled with something I hadn't seen before. Not just gratitude, but genuine respect. Later, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, Joshua offered to walk me back to the boarding house. Caleb had run ahead with the sheriff's grandson, leaving us in a companionable silence, broken only by the distant laughter of children and the gentle rustle of aspen leaves overhead. "Thank you for seeing my son's potential," he said quietly as we neared Hattie's picket fence. "Not many do." The simple sincerity of his words touched something deep within me. Here was no elaborate society compliment designed to flatter without substance, but honest gratitude from a father who wanted only the best for his child. "He makes it easy," I replied truthfully. "He has a remarkable mind, like his mother," Joshua said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips as he offered me his arm for the few remaining steps. I accepted it, feeling the solid strength beneath the worn fabric of his sleeve, drawing comfort from it, even as I reminded myself that such comforts weren't meant for me. "Lord have mercy, child! What have you done to these linens?" Hattie exclaimed, holding up what had once been my white shirtwaist, now an unfortunate shade of mottled gray. 6 weeks into my new life, my Boston upbringing was proving woefully inadequate preparation for the practical realities of frontier existence. My attempts at self-sufficiency had resulted in disaster after disaster. A smoking stove that refused to light properly, laundry that emerged from washing looking worse than before, and most recently, a loaf of bread so dense and misshapen that Hattie's normally polite boarders had exchanged alarmed glances when I'd proudly presented it at breakfast. "I'm afraid I'm making rather a mess of things," I admitted, surveying the damage with dismay. To her credit, Hattie neither laughed nor scolded. Instead, she hung the ruined garment back on the line and placed a motherly arm around my shoulders. "No shame in not knowing," she assured me. "But there's pride in learning. My own mother always said, 'Ignorance is temporary if you're willing to listen.'" Over the following weeks, Hattie became my guide to frontier domesticity, teaching me to build a proper fire, to use bluing for whitening clothes, to bake bread that actually rose. She demonstrated how to preserve the late summer bounty for winter months and instructed me in the medicinal properties of local plants. "Every woman west of the Mississippi knows 3 things," she informed me while showing me how to make a poultice for inflammation: how to shoot straight, how to birth babies, and how to doctor what ails without a physician's help. I was mastering none of these skills with any particular aptitude, but I found unexpected satisfaction in the learning. Each small success, bread that rose properly, a fire that didn't smoke, a shirt scrubbed to respectable whiteness, felt like another stitch securing my new identity. It was during one such lesson, as Hattie taught me to make soap from rendered fat and lye, that Mrs. Foster made one of her unannounced visits. The mercantile owner had a habit of appearing when least expected, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "How domestic you've become, Mrs. Wilson," she remarked, settling her substantial frame at Hattie's kitchen table without invitation. "One wouldn't guess your previous occupation involved more scholarly pursuits." "Teaching doesn't preclude practical skills," I replied, stirring the malodorous mixture with more vigor than necessary, "though I confess I have much to learn." Mrs. Foster's thin smile didn't reach her eyes. "Massachusetts is my husband's home state, you know. He still corresponds with family there regularly. Which county was your academy in, Mrs. Wilson?" The question seemed casual, but instinct warned me it was anything but. "Middlesex," I answered, silently thanking Providence for my excellent geography education. "A very small town. You probably wouldn't know it." Mrs. Foster's smile tightened further. "I know most every town in New England, being such an avid correspondent. Perhaps you could refresh my memory about which particular community." Before I could fabricate a suitable answer, Hattie intervened. "Gracious, Eunice, you're worse than the sheriff with your interrogations. Leave the poor woman be. She's trying to learn soap making, not geography." Mrs. Foster's eyes narrowed fractionally, but she allowed the subject to change. As she departed some minutes later, however, the calculating look she cast over her shoulder sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The town square had transformed for the harvest festival, draped with colorful bunting and dotted with stalls offering everything from candied apples to handcrafted toys. Hay bales created seating areas around a cleared space for dancing, and the sound of a fiddle tuning up promised evening entertainment once the children's games concluded. As the newly established teacher, I'd been drafted to help organize activities, sack races, apple bobbing, and spelling competitions with modest prizes for the winners. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the festivities, warming the crisp October air just enough for comfort. "You've done well with the children's program," came Joshua's voice beside me as I watched a group of my students competing to see who could roll a hoop the farthest without letting it fall. "They respect you." I turned to find him looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him, his customary dark work clothes replaced by a clean white shirt and darker vest. He'd even tamed his usually unruly hair for the occasion. "They're good children," I replied, eager to learn, most of them. "Caleb's reading has improved," he mentioned, a note of wonder in his voice. "He actually asked for a book yesterday. Never thought I'd see the day." Pride warmed me from within. "He's working very hard," I said, watching as Caleb participated in a three-legged race, lashed together with the blacksmith's daughter. Their peals of laughter carried across the square as they tumbled into the dust together. "Would you care to walk with me?" Joshua asked suddenly. "I'd be honored to escort you through the festivities." Something in his tone sent my heart beating faster than proper. "I'd like that," I heard myself answer. We strolled through the square, stopping to admire handiwork displayed by the Ladies' Aid Society, sampling roasted corn from the Gunderson farm, and chatting with townspeople in a way that felt surprisingly natural. In these moments, I almost believed in my fabricated identity. Almost forgot that Mrs. Lee Wilson was a fiction created out of desperate necessity. As twilight descended, lanterns were lit around the square, casting pools of golden light that transformed the humble town gathering into something magical. The fiddler struck up a lively tune joined by a banjo and harmonica, and couples began to form for dancing. Joshua hesitated beside me, his usual confidence momentarily wavering. "Would you honor me, Mrs. Wilson?" he asked, extending his hand toward me. I should have declined. Propriety dictated that a widow of less than a year should not participate in such festivities. More importantly, every moment in Joshua's company heightened the risk of him discovering my deception. Yet I found myself placing my gloved hand in his, allowing him to lead me into the circle of dancers. His hand at my waist was respectful yet steady as we moved through the figures of the dance, turning, separating, coming together again in the pattern dictated by the music and the caller's instructions. In his arms, a curious duality overtook me. I felt safer than I had since fleeing Boston, anchored by his solid presence and unwavering strength. Yet simultaneously, terror coursed through me, not of him, but of the growing feelings I could not allow myself. Every smile, every gentle touch, every moment of connection threaded another strand into a bond that would eventually strangle me when the truth emerged. As the music swelled and lantern light caught the warmth in his dark eyes, I knew with painful clarity that I was walking a dangerous path. The life I was building in Redemption Creek, my teaching, my friendships, and most especially whatever was growing between Joshua Hayes and myself, was built upon a foundation of falsehood that could collapse at any moment. Yet for this one dance, with his hand warm against mine and the stars emerging in the darkening sky above us, I allowed myself to imagine a different future. One where my past remained buried and my heart was free to follow where it increasingly wished to lead. Chapter 4: Winter's Approach. I awoke to a world transformed. November had arrived with silent majesty overnight, blanketing Redemption Creek in pristine white that sparkled like diamond dust in the early morning sunlight. The familiar landscape outside my boarding house window had vanished, replaced by softened contours and alabaster brilliance that dazzled the eye. Downstairs, Hattie hummed as she stoked the kitchen stove. "First snow's always special," she remarked, pouring me a steaming cup of coffee. "Children'll be beside themselves today." She was right. My students arrived at the schoolhouse flushed with excitement, their cheeks rosy from the cold, woolen mittens crusted with snow, and eyes bright with the particular joy that only the first snowfall can bring. Even the older children shed their usual studied indifference, stamping snow from their boots and talking over one another about snowball fights and sledding possibilities. Observing their barely contained enthusiasm, I made an impulsive decision. "Children," I announced, setting aside the grammar lessons I'd planned, "we'll have our lessons outside today." Their exclamations of delight brought a smile to my lips as I outlined my requirements. "We'll build snowmen, but this is still school. You'll work in pairs to measure your creation's height, circumference, and proportions. Then you'll write 3 complete sentences describing your snowman using at least 5 adjectives each. The best descriptions will be read aloud tomorrow." Education disguised as play, I congratulated myself as they scrambled for their wraps, suddenly eager for schoolwork. Outside, the morning air bit with crystalline crispness as we tramped through knee-deep snow to the schoolyard. Small hands worked with surprising efficiency, rolling increasingly large snowballs and debating proper proportions with scientific seriousness. "Mrs. Wilson, is it acceptable to use coal for the eyes, or would that be wasteful?" Rebecca Miller asked, her 12-year-old face pinched with sudden concern. "I think we can spare a few pieces for the sake of education," I assured her, helping 6-year-old Timmy Sullivan secure a crooked twig arm on his lopsided creation. For 2 glorious hours, rulers and string were employed to measure, notebooks were balanced precariously on mittened hands for calculations, and vocabulary expanded as children sought increasingly descriptive words for their snow sculptures. My own hands had gone numb despite my gloves, but the children's laughter warmed me from within. When we finally returned to the schoolhouse, cheeks flaming and clothes dampened from our exertions, we discovered Joshua Hayes stacking firewood near the pot-bellied stove. He straightened as we tumbled in, his eyes immediately finding mine across the room. "Learning comes in many forms, I see," he commented, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he took in our snow-covered appearance. "The best lessons don't always require books," I replied, helping the smallest children remove sodden mittens and scarves. Joshua nodded, adding another log to the now roaring stove. The warmth from the fire touched my chilled skin, but it was the warmth in his gaze, passing over the children's heads to meet mine, that seemed to thaw something deeper within. A moment of shared understanding passed between us. Appreciation for childhood's simple joys and the value of learning that extends beyond classroom walls. I looked away first, suddenly flustered by the intimacy of that unspoken exchange. "Children, hang your wet things by the stove and take your seats. While we warm up, we'll practice our multiplication tables." As Joshua quietly took his leave, I found myself wondering when exactly this taciturn rancher had begun to occupy so many of my thoughts. I'll never read proper, Caleb muttered, throwing down his book with such force that the spine cracked against the desktop. Frustration radiated from his rigid shoulders as he glared at the offending text. Letters keep jumping around like jackrabbits. 3 afternoons each week, Caleb remained after school for special reading lessons. His progress over the past month had been steady, but punctuated by setbacks that tested his fragile confidence. Today had brought a particularly difficult passage that had defeated his best efforts. Rather than immediately retrieving the book, I sat beside him, close enough to offer support but not so near as to crowd his wounded pride. My mother told me something I never forgot, I said quietly. Difficulty doesn't mean inability. It just means finding another path. Caleb glanced at me sideways, suspicion and hope warring in his expression. Your ma sounds smart. She was. A genuine smile touched my lips at the memory. She taught me that perseverance matters more than perfection. When I struggled with mathematics, she found different ways to explain concepts until one finally made sense to me. This revelation, that his seemingly perfect teacher had her own academic challenges, visibly surprised the boy. You weren't good at numbers? Terrible, I admitted. But I kept trying, and eventually I found methods that worked for my particular mind. Caleb considered this, his brow furrowed in thought. After a moment, he reached for the book again. Maybe we could try that colored paper again? The blue one helped some last week. An excellent suggestion, I agreed, retrieving the tinted transparency sheets I'd created based on information gleaned from educational journals. Some students with Caleb's difficulties found that colored overlays reduced the apparent movement of letters on the page. We worked for another half hour, Caleb tracing words with his finger as he read aloud, pausing when necessary but persisting with stubborn determination that increasingly defined his character. The sound of boots on the schoolhouse steps signaled Joshua's arrival to collect his son. He typically waited outside until our lesson concluded, but today Caleb called out immediately, "Pa, come hear me read this." Joshua entered, removing his hat respectfully, a question in his eyes as he looked from his son's eager face to mine. Go ahead, Caleb, I encouraged gently. The boy straightened his shoulders and began reading from McGuffey's Third Reader, a passage about pioneer courage that had defeated him earlier. His voice started uncertainly but gained confidence with each sentence. Though he stumbled over several words and substituted one or two, he completed an entire paragraph without stopping. The look of amazement and pride that transformed Joshua's normally stoic features made my heart swell within my chest. He stood perfectly still, hat clutched in white-knuckled hands, as though afraid any movement might break the spell of his son's achievement. That's real fine, son, he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. Real fine reading. Caleb beamed, the struggle of moments earlier forgotten in the glow of his father's approval. As they departed together, Joshua paused in the doorway, looking back at me with such naked gratitude that I had to turn away, suddenly afraid he might see more in my expression than was proper for a teacher to reveal. The school Christmas pageant consumed my every spare moment throughout December. What had begun as a simple recitation of the nativity story had somehow expanded into an elaborate production involving costumes, musical accompaniment, and a wooden stable backdrop that required actual construction. I'd be happy to help with the carpentry, Joshua volunteered after I mentioned the project following Sunday services. Got plenty of scrap lumber that would suit. And so our collaboration began. Each evening after school, once Caleb had gone to spend time with Sheriff Daniel's wife, who was teaching him to play checkers, Joshua would arrive with tools and lumber. Together we worked in the schoolhouse, measuring and sawing by lamplight as the December darkness fell early outside the frosted windows. It was during these quiet hours, with only the sound of hammering and the occasional direction between us, that our conversations deepened beyond the superficial exchanges of town life. I learned that Joshua had come west as a young man, drawn by the promise of land and independence. He'd built his ranch from nothing, working first as a hired hand until he could purchase his own small parcel. Sarah, my wife, she was the local school marm when I met her, he told me one evening, as he carefully shaped a wooden support. Smart as they come, could recite Shakespeare and do figures faster than anyone I ever knew. She sounds remarkable, I said, meaning it sincerely. She was. His hand stilled momentarily. We had 5 good years before Caleb came along. She'd been so excited about the baby. The sorrow in his voice made me set aside the costume I was mending. "What happened?" I asked gently. Joshua's shoulders tensed beneath his flannel shirt. "I was away driving cattle to market, been gone near 3 weeks when she went into labor early. Neighbor's boy rode out to find me, but by the time I made it back," his voice faltered. "Childbed fever, Doc called it. Nothing to be done." The raw pain in his expression spoke of a wound that 5 years had scarred over but never truly healed. "I wasn't there when she needed me most," he confessed, driving a nail with more force than necessary. "That's a debt I can never repay." My heart ached for his burden of guilt. "Grief isn't something we overcome," I said carefully, thinking of my own mother's passing and the years it had taken to speak of her without that immediate clutch of pain. "It's something we learn to carry differently over time." Joshua looked up, meeting my gaze with surprise, as though hearing his innermost thoughts given voice. "That's it, exactly. The weight doesn't lessen, but somehow you find better ways to bear it." We returned to our work, the silence between us now comfortable rather than awkward. As I reached for a hammer, our hands touched, fingers brushing against each other's with an unexpected jolt of awareness. Neither of us pulled away immediately. When I finally did, my hand tingled where his callous fingers had touched mine, and I found myself unaccountably breathless. "Mrs. Wilson, might I have a word?" Sheriff Daniels intercepted me as I descended the church steps following Sunday services. The December morning was bracingly cold, my breath forming white clouds in the air as I paused. "Of course, Sheriff. Is everything all right?" He guided me a few steps away from the departing congregation, his weathered face unusually serious beneath his silver-streaked mustache. "Telegram came for me yesterday. Thought you should know. Boston authorities seeking information on a missing woman named Eleanor Montgomery, daughter of some banking fellow." My blood ran cold, despite the heavy woolen cloak wrapped around my shoulders. Sheriff Daniels might as well have fired his revolver for the shock that jolted through me. "How interesting," I managed, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Any description?" "Just says she might have headed west. Apparently left right before her wedding. Family's offering a substantial reward for information." He shrugged. "Probably nothing to do with our town, but thought I'd mention it, you being from Massachusetts and all." I forced my frozen lips into what I hoped resembled a smile. "How thoughtful of you to inform me. I'm sure the poor family must be worried sick." "Likely just some society girl who got cold feet," the sheriff said. "Can't blame her, really. These arranged marriages can be mighty uncomfortable for the ladies involved." As he touched his hat brim and moved away, I became aware of eyes upon me. Turning slightly, I discovered Mrs. Foster standing near the church door, her sharp gaze focused intently on our exchange. Even at this distance, I could see the calculation in her expression, the narrowing of her eyes as she glanced from the sheriff's retreating form back to my surely pale face. She knew, or at least she suspected. I clutched my prayer book tighter, nodding politely to Reverend Thomas as I hurried toward the boarding house, my sanctuary suddenly feeling far less secure than it had mere moments ago. Christmas Eve transformed the simple church into a vision of humble splendor. Evergreen boughs scented the air with their sharp, clean fragrance, and dozens of candles cast golden light over the assembled townspeople. The children of Redemption Creek, scrubbed clean and dressed in their Sunday best, fidgeted with nervous excitement as they prepared to present the Christmas story. My heart swelled with pride as they performed their parts with touching sincerity, from Timothy Sullivan's solemn-faced Joseph to Rebecca Miller's radiant Mary cradling a doll wrapped in white flannel. Even Caleb, who had initially balked at speaking before the entire town, delivered his shepherd's lines clearly, the blue-tinted paper I'd provided hidden discreetly within his costume. Joshua's beautifully crafted stable backdrop drew admiring comments, its rough-hewn authenticity lending reality to the simple pageant. As the children sang the final carol, their sweet voices filling the church with silent night, I glimpsed Joshua watching from the back row, his face softened with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Later, as the congregation dispersed into the gently falling snow, he approached me outside the church steps. Snowflakes dusted his dark hair and the shoulders of his best coat, giving him an almost ethereal appearance in the lantern light. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. With careful hands, he presented me with a carved wooden box, no larger than my palm, its lid inlaid with a delicate pattern of leaves. "Joshua, it's beautiful." I breathed, running my fingers over the polished surface, recognizing the hours of craftsmanship it represented. "Open it," he urged softly. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay a delicate silver pendant on a slender chain. The simple design, a tiny book open to reveal a miniature rose, caught the lamplight with subdued elegance. "Joshua, I couldn't possibly," I began, overwhelmed by both the gift and what it surely signified. "It was my mother's," he interrupted gently. "She taught school before marrying my father." His voice deepened, taking on a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the cold night air between us. "Mrs. Wilson, Ellie, I've grown to care for you deeply. I know it's been only months since your husband's passing, but I'd like your permission to court you properly." Joy and panic warred within me with such ferocity that I could scarcely breathe. How desperately I wanted to accept what he offered, this good, honest man who had come to mean more to me than I dared admit even to myself. Yet the web of deception I had woven now entangled us both. Every moment we grew closer was another moment I betrayed his trust. "I'm honored, truly," I managed, closing the box and pressing it back into his hands. "But I'm not ready. I'm sorry." Before he could respond, before I could weaken and take back my words, I turned and hurried away, my vision blurring with unshed tears. Behind me, through the gently falling curtain of white, stood Joshua, alone, confused, and holding a gift I had refused for reasons he couldn't possibly understand. The snow fell silently around us both, each flake another secret, another lie, another barrier between my heart and the future it increasingly yearned to claim. Chapter 5: Secrets and Storms. The first dawn of January 1874 crept reluctantly through my window, pale winter light illuminating the frost patterns that delicate fingers of cold had etched across the glass overnight. I sat alone in my room, still dressed in my nightgown despite the chill, Mother's Bible open in my lap. The same verses in Proverbs had drawn my eyes repeatedly throughout my sleepless night. "The truthful lip shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment." Divine judgment for my deception, rendered in elegant script on tissue-thin pages. I traced the words with my fingertip, feeling the slight indentation of each letter as though they were branded into my skin, rather than merely printed on paper. The new year had arrived with festive celebration in Redemption Creek, a community supper at the church followed by hymn singing and prayers for prosperity in the coming months. I had attended out of obligation, carefully positioning myself among the school children to avoid any private conversation with Joshua. His wounded eyes had followed me throughout the evening, his confusion at my sudden withdrawal evident in every glance I pretended not to notice. A gentle knock at the door interrupted my brooding. "Mrs. Wilson?" Hattie's voice called softly. "Brought you some tea, dear. May I come in?" I hastily wiped away a stray tear and straightened my shoulders. "Of course, Hattie." The door creaked open, revealing my landlady bearing a steaming cup and a concerned expression. She set the tea on my bedside table and settled her substantial frame on the edge of my bed, the springs protesting slightly beneath her weight. "Noticed you've been avoiding certain folks lately," she said gently, her weathered hand smoothing her apron. "Particularly a certain rancher who can't seem to take his eyes off you." She tilted her head, studying my face with motherly perception. "A woman recognizes heartache in another woman." The simple kindness in her voice unraveled what remained of my composure. "I've made a terrible mess of things, Hattie," I whispered, tears threatening once more. She patted my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "Life rarely travels straight paths, child. Sometimes the longest route teaches us what we need to learn." Her faded blue eyes held no judgment, only the wisdom of years and experiences I could scarcely imagine. The good Lord has his reasons for the journey he sets before each of us. I touched Mother's Bible, feeling its familiar weight, the one true thing I had carried from my past life. What if the truth would destroy everything good I've found here? The question emerged unbidden, dangerously close to confession. Hattie's gaze remained steady. Truth has a way of surfacing, like a spring through mountain rock. Better to guide its course than be swept away when it bursts forth. She stood, smoothing her skirts. Whatever burdens you carry, remember you don't carry them alone. The Lord's shoulders are broader than ours. She left me to my tea and my thoughts, neither of which provided the comfort I desperately sought. Throughout January, I maintained a careful distance from Joshua Hayes. When our paths crossed at church or town gatherings, I offered civil greetings that gave no opportunity for private conversation. During Caleb's after-school lessons, I ensured another student remained as well, creating a buffer against any personal discussion when Joshua arrived to collect his son. He respected my boundaries with a dignity that only intensified my guilt. No demands for explanation, no public display of hurt feelings. Only a quiet confusion in his dark eyes, and a formality that had replaced the warmth we had briefly shared. His "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wilson," carried the weight of a dozen unasked questions. One particularly bitter Tuesday afternoon found me teaching a geography lesson about major American cities. I had drawn a passable map of Boston on the blackboard, indicating the various neighborhoods and explaining their significance. Beacon Hill stands among the most elite addresses, I explained, chalk tapping against the slate. The finest families have resided there for generations, their homes overlooking the Common. Commonwealth Avenue, though newer, boasts equally impressive residences. The Back Bay area was once quite literally a bay that has been filled in to create new land for expansion. I continued detailing the social hierarchy written into Boston's very streets, only becoming aware of my excessive enthusiasm when I noticed the children's rapt attention. I had revealed far more intimate knowledge than a small-town teacher from a modest academy should reasonably possess. Caleb Hayes, sharp-minded despite his reading difficulties, tilted his head curiously. "You sure know a lot about fancy people, Mrs. Wilson." A flutter of panic rose in my chest. "Good teachers learn many things, Caleb," I replied, forcing a light tone while turning quickly to the blackboard. "Now, who can tell me the principal exports of Massachusetts?" When the final bell rang and the children filed out, I remained at my desk organizing papers, relieved to have weathered the small moment of suspicion. My relief was short-lived, however, as a familiar voice spoke from the doorway. "Fascinating lesson today." Mrs. Foster stood just inside the schoolroom, her dark wool dress severe against the whitewashed walls, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. "I was returning some books to your shelf and couldn't help but overhear." Her thin smile never reached her eyes. "Your knowledge of Boston's elite neighborhoods is impressive for a small-town teacher." I met her gaze steadily, though my heart hammered beneath my high-necked blouse. "My academy served wealthy families," I answered, the familiar half-truth coming easily now. "One learns through observation." "Indeed." She placed several McGuffey readers on my desk with deliberate precision. "Observation can be most educational. For instance, I've observed that no one from Middlesex County has heard of the small academy where you claim to have taught." The threat in her words hung between us, unspoken but unmistakable. "How fortunate that my credentials satisfied the town council," I replied, matching her cool tone while gathering my belongings. "If you'll excuse me, Mrs. Foster, I have papers to grade." She departed with a rustle of heavy skirts and a promise in her eyes that our conversation was far from concluded. February announced itself with plummeting temperatures and skies the color of tarnished silver. The winds that swept down from the mountains carried whispers of approaching storms, and longtime residents muttered warnings about the worst winter in a decade. I had just begun the afternoon arithmetic lesson when the schoolhouse door burst open without warning. Joshua Hayes stood framed in the doorway, snow crusting his shoulders and hat, his expression grim beneath wind-reddened cheek. "Mrs. Wilson?" he said, voice carrying easily over the suddenly silent classroom. "Storms moving faster than expected. Weather Service sent warnings along the telegraph line." The children immediately erupted in excited whispers, snowbound days being the particular delight of young scholars everywhere. Joshua's authoritative voice cut through their chatter. I'm escorting everyone home safely. Those on outlying farms have already been collected by their parents. Town children need to gather their things immediately. I moved quickly, helping the smallest children bundle into coats and scarves, while instructing the older ones to carry their readers home for study. Outside, the sky had darkened ominously, and snow had begun falling in earnest, fat flakes driven sideways by the strengthening wind. Joshua lifted 6-year-old Emma Peterson onto his shoulders, her small face nearly hidden within her woolen scarf. Together, we shepherded the remaining 12 children through rapidly deepening snow, delivering each safely to their doorsteps. Joshua carried the youngest through the worst drifts, while I guided the older ones, forming a human chain as visibility deteriorated around us. After delivering the final student to his worried mother, we stood alone in the worsening conditions, the wind howling down the narrow street between buildings. "I'll see you safely to the boarding house," Joshua insisted, snow already whitening his dark beard and eyebrows. "That's not necessary," I began, reluctant to spend even these few minutes alone with him. "It wasn't a request, Mrs. Wilson." His formal tone reflected the careful distance I had established between us these past weeks, the hard-won familiarity of Ellie long abandoned. I nodded reluctantly, and we set off into the blinding white. The short walk to Hattie's boarding house had become treacherous, the familiar path obscured by wind-blown drifts that reached past my knees. Halfway there, the wind shifted violently, a wall of snow and ice crystals slamming into us with physical force. Without hesitation, Joshua pulled me against the sheltered side of the mercantile building, his body shielding mine from the worst of the gale. His arms formed a protective barrier on either side of me, his broad shoulders breaking the wind's force. I pressed my face against the rough wool of his coat, grateful for the momentary reprieve from the storm's assault. "We'll wait for this gust to pass," he said, his voice close to my ear to be heard above the wind's howl. Despite all my careful distancing, despite the wall of propriety and pretense I had constructed between us, I felt that same impossible safety in his presence. My body recognized what my mind fought against, that in Joshua Hayes's arms lay a shelter more profound than mere physical protection from the elements. When the wind subsided marginally, he guided me the remaining distance to Hattie's door, his hand firm at my elbow, steadying me through the deepest drifts. At the threshold, I turned to thank him, but he had already tipped his hat and turned away, a dark figure dissolving into the white curtain of the storm. The blizzard raged through the night, rattling windows and moaning down the chimney like a tormented spirit. I slept fitfully, waking often to the storm's crescendos, each time remembering Joshua's face as he had left me, stoic, dutiful, the hurt carefully masked beneath frontier practicality. Dawn brought no relief, only a strange half-light filtered through still falling snow. I had just finished dressing when Hattie's urgent pounding rattled my door. "Eleanor, come quick!" The use of my first name rather than the formal Mrs. Wilson signaled emergency more clearly than her tone. "Joshua's here. It's Caleb. He's missing." I flew down the stairs, still fastening the buttons at my throat, to find Joshua standing in Hattie's parlor. The sight of him stole my breath, not the composed, capable man who had shielded me from yesterday's storm, but a father hollowed by fear. His face was drawn, eyes red-rimmed from what might have been exhaustion or suppressed tears, his usual neat appearance abandoned in crisis. "He wasn't in his bed this morning," Joshua said without preamble, his voice rough. "Must have gone out during the night. I found tracks leading away from the house, already half filled with new snow." "Why would he leave during a storm?" I asked, disbelief warring with growing horror. Joshua's hand trembled slightly as he extended a crumpled paper. Found this on his pillow, the childish scrawl with its characteristic reversed letters blurred before my eyes as I read. "Gone to find proof. Mrs. Wilson is an angel sent to help us. Back soon. Don't worry." "Angel," I whispered, confusion momentarily overriding fear. "It's what he calls you when we're alone," Joshua explained, a flush of embarrassment briefly coloring his haggard face. "Ever since you began helping him read. Said God must have sent you special to us." His voice broke. "He mentioned some cave where he goes to think, up near the ridge. Said he found something there once that would prove you were heaven sent. My mind raced, then seized upon a memory. Caleb proudly showing me his secret place after school one autumn afternoon. An abandoned mine entrance, I said, already reaching for my coat. I know where that is. He showed me once after school. We have to go now. Joshua's relief at my knowledge was palpable. Sheriff's organizing search parties, but with the storm. There's no time to wait, I interrupted, wrapping a woolen scarf around my neck and stuffing gloves into my pockets. That mine entrance didn't look stable even in good weather. Hattie pressed a flask of coffee and bundle of biscuits into my hands. The Lord go with you both, she whispered, making the sign of the cross as we stepped out into the blinding white world. Each step through the hip-deep snow required monumental effort. Joshua forged a path ahead of me, his powerful shoulders driving forward through drifts that would have stopped me completely. The bitter cold infiltrated every layer of clothing, numbing my face and hands despite woolen protection. The normally 30-minute walk to the foothills stretched into an interminable journey, each moment stretching agonizingly as the temperature continued to drop. Joshua moved with single-minded determination, his only concession to my presence an occasional glance back to ensure I still followed. Words became precious resources neither of us could afford to waste, our breath forming thick clouds that crystallized instantly in the frigid air. At last, the dark smudge of the mine entrance appeared through the curtain of falling snow, a jagged wound in the hillside partially obscured by a century-old pine. My heart sank at the sight. The entrance, never particularly stable, had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. Joshua rushed forward, calling his son's name with desperate hope. For one terrible moment, silence answered him. Then, faintly from within the darkness, came Caleb's voice. "Pa? That you?" The relief that flooded Joshua's face transformed him. "I'm here, son. Are you hurt?" "My leg's stuck under some rocks," came the frightened reply. "I can't move it. It's real dark in here, Pa." Joshua immediately began tearing at the snow and debris blocking the entrance, but it soon became apparent that the opening had contracted to a space far too small for his broad shoulders. Each attempt to widen it brought more material sliding down from above, threatening to seal the entrance entirely. "I'll go," I said, already removing my heavy coat. The bitter cold bit through my woolen dress, but the bulky outerwear would never fit through the constricted space. "It's too dangerous," Joshua began, his face anguished with the impossible choice before him. "There's no time to argue." I met his eyes directly, willing him to trust me with his most precious possession. "Trust me, Joshua." Something in my voice must have reached him, for he nodded once, sharply. "Take this," he said, handing me a small miner's lamp from his pocket. "And this." He unwound his scarf, wrapping it around my neck atop my own. "Call out so I know you're all right." The opening was barely wide enough for my shoulders. I squeezed through sideways, feeling sharp rocks tear at my dress and scrape against my skin. The darkness beyond swallowed me whole until I fumbled to light the small lamp Joshua had provided. "Caleb?" I called, my voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Mrs. Wilson?" Disbelief colored the boy's voice. "You came for me?" I followed the sound, careful of loose rocks underfoot, until the lamplight revealed Caleb huddled against the far wall of what appeared to be an abandoned prospector's cave rather than a proper mine. His small face was pale with cold and fear, tear tracks frozen on his cheeks. His right leg disappeared beneath a pile of fallen debris, not massive boulders as I had feared, but an accumulation of smaller rocks and dirt that had given way from the unstable ceiling. "Of course I came," I said, kneeling beside him, setting the lamp carefully on a flat stone. "Your father and I would never leave you alone." I quickly assessed his condition, cold and frightened but alert. "Let's free that leg and get you home to warm up." As I worked to carefully remove the debris pinning his limb, I kept up a steady stream of conversation to distract him from pain and fear. I sang hymns in a voice that trembled only slightly and recited poetry from memory, all while methodically freeing his trapped leg inch by inch. "Is it true what Pa said?" Caleb asked suddenly. "That you're not going to be friends with us anymore?" My hands stilled. "What makes you think that?" Heard Pa telling Sheriff you didn't want to talk to him anymore, that you pushed him away. His young face creased with confusion. Did we do something wrong? No, sweetheart, you've done nothing wrong, I assured him, resuming my work with renewed determination. Grown-up friendships are complicated sometimes. You're not really an angel, are you? He asked, disappointment evident despite his predicament. I found a fancy handkerchief here once. Had initials on it, E.M. Thought it was proof you were sent special to help me learn reading. My heart nearly stopped. The monogrammed handkerchief I'd missed weeks ago, a remnant of Eleanor Montgomery that could connect me to the telegram the sheriff had received. Angels don't get cold or scared, I told him truthfully. And I'm certainly both right now. Finally, his leg came free, bruised and scraped, but miraculously unbroken. I helped him stand, supporting his weight as he tested his injured limb. I can walk, he announced with determined bravery, though his face paled at the first step. Let me help you, I said, wrapping my arm around his waist. Your father is waiting just outside. Together we navigated the short distance to the cave entrance, where Joshua's anxious face appeared in the narrow opening. He's all right, I called. Legs bruised but not broken. Getting Caleb through the constricted entrance proved challenging but not impossible. Joshua reached through, pulling his son carefully into his arms while I guided the boy's injured leg through the narrow space. When I finally squeezed through myself, Joshua gathered us both in his embrace, one strong arm around each of us. Caleb nestled between us, and Joshua's free hand cupped the back of my head, drawing me closer into their circle of warmth. Thank God, he whispered hoarsely, his breath warm against my frozen cheek. Thank God for you both. For one brief, perfect moment, I allowed myself to imagine this was my real life, that I was truly Ellie Wilson, that these arms had the right to hold me, that this man and boy were my real family. Reality would return soon enough with its complications and consequences, but for now, as the snow continued to fall gently around our huddled forms, I permitted myself this single moment of belonging.